All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Scrubbing the Skies, the webinar series of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal. The Institute is a research center at American University in Washington, D.C. Our mission is to contribute to the progressive and responsible development of the governance of an emerging suite of carbon dioxide removal options, foster notions of equity and justice as the CDR industry develops, and contribute to the structuring of robust public engagement. I'm Wil Burns, co-director of the Institute and your host for the webinar series. One of the most important and ongoing issues in the field of carbon dioxide removal is the issue of durability and what should count as durable carbon dioxide removal solutions. This has critical implications for the integrity of claims associated with carbon dioxide removal, as well as implication of the business model for many companies, both on the buyer side and the seller side of the equation. A new study published in the journal Environmental Science and Policy by Stephanie Arcusa and Klaus Lackner at Arizona State University looks at both the current terrain for assessment of durability and suggests a way forward. The title of the paper is Carbon Sequestration Ought to be Permanent on Climate Relevant Timescales. We're fortunate today to have the lead author with us, Stephanie Arcusa, and she will discuss the paper. And as usual, we'll follow the following format. We'll have an initial intervention by Stephanie for approximately 20 minutes to summarize the findings of the paper. I'll then move to a few questions to seed the conversation, and then we will move to audience questions. And in that latter context, I encourage everyone to begin to populate the question and answer box as soon as possible, so I have an idea of how much time we should accord for that. And with that, I will turn over the dais to Stephanie.
Well, thanks very much, Wil. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about this topic that's quite dear at heart for me. So let me share my screen here in a second. All right, pulling this up. All right. So this is about a paper we just published, my colleague and I, Klaus Lackner. And in very brief, this is about carbon markets and climate pledges, depending on the durability of carbon storage. But what counts as durable? Is it 10 years? Is it 100? Is it 10,000 years? In this new paper, we argue that carbon sequestration must last as long as the carbon's effect on climate, which is tens of thousands of years when we consider ocean acidification. But we also argue that this is only true if societies want to uphold certain principles, the principles of intergenerational equity and the principle of the polluter pays. And we conclude that in the current state of affairs, which allows for temporary storage that is orphaned within decades, this implicitly has abandoned intergenerational equity, at least in the context of climate change and its consequences. So we begin our paper with the observation that efforts the world committed to under the Paris Agreement in COP21 to limit the increase of global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius have essentially failed. Global warming has exceeded 1.5 degrees for the entirety of the year of 2024, and this is unlikely to stop anytime soon. The continuing rise of atmospheric CO2, carbon dioxide, that caused this situation is irreversible without human intervention. One such intervention collects CO2 and sequesters it or stores it in reservoirs like biomass, oceans, rocks, and products. If the CO2 or other forms of carbon are collected from the environment, the technology is usually referred to as carbon dioxide removal, which you see here on the left. But if the CO2 is intercepted before it enters the environment, then it is often referred to as carbon capture and storage, CCS for short. But the focus of our discussion is actually on a problem that they both share, which is storage. Both CCS and CDR must store the carbon. And that means they both have a problem of how durable is the storage. In most reports, durability refers to the duration of sequestration, which is dictated by the physical characteristics of the reservoir. And this durability varies by reservoir. So for example, if you store carbon in soils, this may last for decades to centuries. But if you store carbon in deep saline aquifers, then the expected duration is something that exceeds tens of thousands of years. In this concept, we also have to acknowledge that each of these storage reservoirs also have risks of premature carbon release due to biophysical risks, for example, in soils, or unexpected engineering leaks in the saline reservoirs. But the central question we were trying to answer in our paper is not actually about the expected lifetime of a particular sequestration method. The question we were concerned with is how long is long enough? Since most people agree that storage times have to be quite long, long enough is often referred to as permanent. And you probably already know this, but there's quite a bit of disagreement about the use of the word permanence. I myself in the past have argued that permanence is not the appropriate term to talk about the desired storage times. And the dislike of the term permanence is a reason why the term durability has been introduced in the broader community to try and avoid what was considered a very loaded word. But in this paper, I essentially changed my mind. And that's because I've finally been able to explain, at least to myself, why this disagreement with the word exists. And that's because permanence can be thought of as a boundary object. A boundary object is something that has meaning to many communities, but that meaning is different. So what is considered permanent varies widely across scientific, commercial, political actors, and there is no consensus on which is the most relevant duration. So for all these groups, permanence indicates a duration that exceeds typically relevant timescales. And what timescales are relevant depends on the community. So for example, for businesses and economists, discount rates implicitly define a time constant that make a 100-year look permanent. But for those who are concerned with intergenerational justice, 100 years is likely way too short. But here too, 1,000 years is too long. And that's because we don't have very many problems in our society that last that long. One exception, of course, is nuclear waste. And the huge disagreements about what to do with nuclear waste is an example that societies really do care about how we take care of our waste. Now, on the earth science side, 1,000 years is also too short because the carbon cycle works on scales of tens to hundreds of thousands of years. And if you ask an astrophysicist, they will also tell you the earth itself is not permanent because the sun will eventually engulf it. And so the point here is that it's actually not surprising that we all don't like the word permanence because we all have very different responses from different communities. So in this paper, we're trying to take back the word permanence and look at it from the perspective that the relevant timescale should be that of climate dynamics, which means tens of thousands of years. But we acknowledge that this definition only applies if certain societal principles are upheld. And these principles are the principles of the polluter pays and the principle of intergenerational equity. And together, they demand that today's generation pays for the removal of excess carbon that it has generated with the understanding that it will not return in time to damage the future. The polluter pays is the principle that holds polluter accountable for the cleanup of their actions. It's been adopted in the OECD, but it is not formally part of the United Nations Convention on Climate Change. Intergenerational equity is included as the principle of fair resource utilization between generations. It's been recognized by international environment agreements like the Paris Agreement. So there is precedent for these principles being part of the greater society. So in the paper, we first take the point of view of looking at what the science tells us. And what science is basically telling us is that climate change is primarily driven by carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels, and this accounts for about 90% of all emissions. The scientific evidence shows that the excess carbon dioxide remains in the Earth system for tens of thousands of years, if not hundreds of thousands of years, which is very different to the usual discourse that the climate problem is a century problem. And that's because of the carbon cycle. So in the carbon cycle, some carbon moves between the atmosphere, the land, and the oceans on a speed that's relatively quickly. We're talking about decades to centuries. But when we talk about the slow carbon cycle, which is the other part of the cycle, this is the movement of carbon through the rock cycle, essentially, through mineralization and rock weathering. And this cycle takes hundreds, if not millions of years to operate. So that means that if temporary carbon storage is used, this cannot truly fix the carbon problem, because even small leaks after, let's say, 1,000 years would still cause future warming, as well as ocean acidification. But this differing speeds in the carbon cycle is why CO2 accumulates in the atmosphere and why this is such a long-term problem. And while this body of knowledge is very well established in the earth sciences, it has been peripheral to the discussion among CCS and CDR developers. And by releasing this excess carbon and by acknowledging that it accumulates in the atmosphere, societies have created a problem that will last for thousands of years. And it is now forcing us to decide how much responsibility do we owe future generations. Now, logic dictates that short-term storage merely delays harm. It will not avoid the harm. And what damages are acceptable is a societal decision. If we only care about the temperature damages, then the carbon cycle will take care of this in just a few millennia. But if we also care about ocean acidification, which is a much longer and slower process to take care of, then we're talking about tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years. Now, all major climate initiatives include durable storage as a principle for net zero. So it really matters how durable and permanence are going to be defined. However, what we also find is that the literature is suggesting that the choice of how we define these words has not been settled. Going back to that idea of a boundary object, we're all arguing about a different number. And right now we see that some actors have selected a very short definition, while other actors have selected very long definitions, and there is no consensus between the different communities. So in general, the public and policymakers have focused on a 100-year timescale. This is also how the IPCC calculates the global warming potentials, if you know about these very important factors in carbon accounting. Now, the situation is also quite diverse when we talk about the standards. So here's a graph that a previous student of mine, Emily Haygood, and I put together, where we looked at the contractual duration or the definition of permanence by the different standard developing organizations around the world. And as you can see, we also have a very wide range of definitions at play. And so in the paper, we started to ask, well, how big of a deal is this? And so what we did is we looked at all of the proposals for carbon dioxide removal that were received by one big corporate buyer, Microsoft, back in 2021 and 2022. And the total amount of proposals they received was 142 million tons of carbon storage. And for each proposal, the proposer had indicated how long they thought they could guarantee the storage. So all we did was we tallied for every proposal the duration that it would keep the carbon stored. And this is the result that we saw, which is that within 30 years, 50% of the carbon would likely be orphaned. And by that, we mean that it was no longer indicated that it would be under anybody's responsibility. And so we thought this was quite significant as a result. So then in the paper, we started to think about, well, if we define permanence like we see in all these proposals, for anything that's shorter than the 10,000 years that the carbon cycle requires to clean up the mess, who benefits from this? Who loses from this? So when we look at what we are going to call temporary carbon storage in this context here, this type of storage benefits the present because it delays climate change. And it also lowers costs since it avoids paying for future damages once the storage period ends and the carbon returns into the atmosphere, resuming climate change. Now, it is true that temporary storage does reduce peak warming, and it does buy some time to develop permanent technologies. And because it is cheaper and generally easier to manage, it's very appealing to buyers and sellers in today's carbon markets. So while this type of definition does protect the present, it endangers the future. That's the trade-off. And that's because once the stored carbon is released, the climate impacts simply return. This creates a false sense of progress towards carbon neutrality. And it also risks something called the termination effect, where stopping storage suddenly unleashes severe warming. It also undermines the fairness between generations and disadvantages renewable energy, as well as long-term storage options, because they cannot compete with the low upfront cost of temporary storage. Now, I do have to make an important note here, because temporary storage is in fact possible, and there is ways to argue for it if it comes with an upfront guarantee for resequestration of anything that is lost. So in the continuing discussion here, I'm going to talk about temporary storage in the context of not having this upfront guarantee of resequestration. So there is a case that can be made about temporary storage. The pros is that it provides this flexibility or optionality during the transition to net zero. It can help manage emissions in the short term while permanent solutions scale up. It can be justified if it is accompanied by that resequestration. And some argue that future generations may be better equipped to handle future releases of CO2 if economic growth continues, in which case temporary storage would make sense. But on the downside is that if there is no resequestration guarantee, then temporary storage fails to achieve long-term net zero. And it also makes the assumption that future generations can cope with future climate change. And this in itself is very uncertain and quite self-serving. Now, it also creates legal and financial risks for buyers, similar to industries that have been held liable for their past actions. If you think about the companies that produce asbestos, right? They eventually went bankrupt and got sued. And the world is changing, right? There is this growing awareness about future liability, as we can see from the movements towards loss and damage mechanisms to hold emitters responsible for the carbon that they have emitted. And in our case, this might mean holding emitters responsible for stored carbon that leaks in the future. Now, there's also some reputational risk that come from poorly verified projects that retrospectively would be found to have lost carbon. In the paper, we've pushed this further once we've explored who loses and who benefits, because we want to also ask who is going to pay. And this really hinges on who is the polluter. And the identity of the polluter is not immediately apparent because, in effect, it's everybody. We are all polluters. And carbon producers, those who give us the products that we use and then produce the pollution, carbon producers may not actually be actual polluters, but it is their carbon products that lead to emissions. And we have no agency to manage. In fact, in instances where polluters lack the ability to manage the pollution, the polluter pays principle is extended to the producer pays. And for example, in the European Union, there is the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment Directive, which mandates producers of electrical and electronic equipment to finance the collection and recycling of their products. So we could apply that same principle to climate change, which would imply that the producers of carbon waste would be responsible for the cleanup, considering climate change as a waste management issue. So by carbon producers, I mean those who produce products like oil, natural gas, coal, limestone for cement that we then all use to power our lives. But if we did apply such a conceptual framework to this issue, and if we did apply a uniform requirement for cleanup through sequestration, then it would result in a shared cost amongst all parties involved. And this is an idea that has been conceptualized under the name the carbon storage obligations, sometimes also called the carbon take-back obligations. And finally, we also wanted to take a look at who is deciding how we define permanence. Because at the very beginning, this all started with the United Nations Kyoto Protocol, when they selected 100 years. And this has shaped the political decisions for 30 years. So who will advocate for the future? And we've identified certain international declarations like the Pact for the Future. We've also seen that state commissioners exist for the future, like in Wales or New Zealand. And there are organizations in legal and philosophy that advocate for the future, like the Long Now or the Center for Study of Existential Risk. But as I alluded to earlier, the process of implementing the definition of permanence is really through the standards. And this really raises the question of who is going to start that discussion and when will a new cycle of standardization begin. There are recent initiatives like the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Market and the European Council Carbon Removal Certification Framework that are talking about this, but will they try to have a new definitions on permanence? We don't know yet. So to conclude, the principles of intergenerational equity and the polluter pays requires that carbon emissions are either forbidden or cancelled out by storage that is guaranteed to be permanent on climate-relevant timescales. We argue that based on the damages from temperature and ocean acidification, that this definition should be greater than 10,000 years. Now, of course, there is no institutional means to guarantee these timescales, which means we are going to have to blend guarantees that can be physical or contractual in nature. But all of this may not hold any water because societies have to decide whether or not we will uphold these principles and whether or not we will incorporate them into the policies. But what we find is that the current state of affairs, which allows for temporary storage that is orphaned within decades, is implicitly abandoning intergenerational equity, at least in the context of climate change and its consequences. Thank you.
Great. All right. Thank you so much for that, Stephanie. So let me just ask you a couple of initial questions, and then we'll move to our audience's questions. Uh, so one thing you highlight is obviously this tension between what the science tells us, right, is permanent, right? And I've seen some of these studies that say even at 10,000 years of storage, right, you're maybe mitigating 66% of what happens in terms of emissions, and at 1,000 years, maybe it's like 30%, right? So but at the same time, as you point out, from a legal perspective, from a practical logistics perspective, it's difficult to mandate that, right, and enforce it, right, or impossible, right? So at the end of the day, you indicate on the other side of the spectrum, right, these commitments for 10 or 20 years obviously are chimerical. But what does that mean at the end of the day for what you would advocate for? What should be the minimum standard for durability, and is that minimal standard enforceable in any realistic fashion?
Yeah, there is a tension. And when we look back in the archives of the Earth system, particularly at extreme climate change events like the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum, which was 56 million years ago, we saw back then a 5 to 8 degrees warming
Yep.
over several thousand years. And it took 130,000 years to fix that in a climate system that was unhindered by humans, right? So we are talking about tremendously long timescales. And obviously, humanity has not even been around that long. And we have very little idea of how to keep institutions going for quite that long. I mean, there are some examples, like maybe certain religions, but here we're talking about something that will need to be cared for what is much longer than a human life, what is much longer than society in general. So it is quite a conundrum. So I think what we see is that the current system just doesn't match up with this at all. And it means we're going to have to be creative in how we can manage this issue. And one thing that has become very clear to me is that if we do want to include the shorter term types of carbon storage, and I think we should, because most of them are ready, they are well accepted, and they are in large capacity. So we should find ways to include them. But if we do that, then we need probably two different ways to manage this. One that is contractual, and that is on the basis of very short timescales that we know how to deal. But to make this similar to a longer timescale, then we need upfront guarantees. And these upfront guarantees can come in the form of paying for storage in 20 years, right? And this is the idea of horizontal stacking, that you can buy one credit today, there is a fee, the fee grows in terms of its value, and in 20 years, it's worth the payment of the next storage. And my colleague, Klaus and I, we've calculated this. And when we calculate it on a timescale of, let's say, a contract of 50 years, the fee is equal to 8% of the cost. So
Hmm.
that's quite small. And then that means that for short-term storage, we do have a long-term pathway. Now, you could also say, well, this we could do this like 2 or 3 times, but it doesn't get us to 10,000 years, and that's
Right.
true. And so this is where I think the second part of how we manage this comes into play, which is that there is a scientific way to handle this too, because scientifically we can make a case that certain types of storage will last that long. And I'm
Hmm.
thinking about mineralization, I'm thinking about
Right.
geological storage. And if we can make an ironclad scientific um, consensus type of argument with evidence, then we could say, well, if we follow these pathways in this way, we could end the liability. We could say that it is now permanently sequestered. And so combining these two things, where we have contractual and scientific, we could do contractual for a while, and then the next time we pay, it's for a scientific permanence. So
Right.
that's the type of mechanism I would personally advocate for.
So I'm a little confused with the terms. Wouldn't it ultimately then be contractual in both contexts, right? It seems like what you're proposing is if you're whoever we're ascribing responsibility to, right? If you're an emitter and you can commit to a short-term nature-based credit and then maybe stack another nature-based credit, still in the long term, you would be on the hook when there was sufficient capacity for durable solutions to pay for that, right? And so that would be contractual also, wouldn't it? This quote unquote scientific commitment.
Yes, but it is the end of the liability that's different. So
Hmm.
there are certain types of methods that could never measure up to these types of standards that we're asking for here, whereas some other methods like mineralization could. And so it is by the fact that you will contract with a method that can be scientifically demonstrated to be permanent on these timescales that would end the liability. So I guess you're right. It is both contractual, but one ends, whereas the other requires the upfront purchase of new storage.
Okay, yeah, it's interesting. So another question. I thought that your discussion of polluter pays, right, and intergenerational equity were interesting. I think it's going to be important at some point. May just be my bias as a lawyer, but I think it's going to be important somewhere down the road to have a legal hook to try to legitimate the kind of mandates that you're talking about, right? And so everybody's looking for those kind of principles, right? And I thought intergenerational equity and polluter pays, producer pays makes sense. So I had a couple of questions in that context. One is when I look at the principles of intergenerational equity that you talk about, uh, it's contested, I think, whether that constitutes customary international law at this point, right? And then a lot of the places that you cited, other than the individual countries, were more like soft law pledges, right? Do you think there's places that or treaties that would justify intergenerational equity from a legally binding perspective, such as Paris, for example, that talks about uh, 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 it has an emphasis on protecting future generations also. Is that where we should be trying to pursue some of that, is where in some of the institutions that expressly mandated in treaty language, for example?
Yeah, I think you're asking an important question, and it's hard for me to say because at the end of the day, right now we haven't all agreed that emissions should be outlawed.
Hmm.
We've agreed in principle, but we haven't actually committed to the fact that it's not okay to release emissions into the common atmosphere. And
Yeah.
we are not holding anybody accountable for the fact that they are. And
Right.
unless we do that, I'm not entirely sure where this discussion plays out. And maybe it is actually at the national scale instead
Hmm.
of the international um, forums. So at the end of the day, we have to commit to the fact that we live in a world that has a finite carbon budget. And if we are serious about limiting emissions, limiting temperature rise to a certain threshold, then it means we have to outlaw emissions from being released. And that's either we don't produce them in the first place, or that's we use CCS and CDR. And then we have to start deciding on how long is long enough. Um, I'm not quite sure the international community is moving in that direction fast enough. And perhaps perhaps at the national scale it might go a little faster, but I think I think it's an important question that you're raising. Who's going to actually mandate this?
And so one other question, and then I'm going to move to audience questions. Again, a legal question. You were teasing out the notion of polluter pays, right? Which I think, from a standpoint of law, is more recognized in intergenerational equity in many ways, and certainly operationalized to a higher degree in places like Europe, for example, to some degree here. Um, but you juxtapose that with producer pays, right? And it has very different implications in terms of who is liable and how we proceed. Um, which of the two would you advocate for, and why?
Yeah. Um, so I think I like to think about the problem of climate change as kind of the supply chain of fossil fuels, right? There are these actors who are producing hydrocarbons and then they're distributing them and we're transforming them for things that are useful. And eventually it gets to some kind of consumer like you and I, and we get some use out of it. And up to now, the entire philosophy has been on the end consumer, that because we use these products, we are responsible for the emissions that they are producing. And sometimes it's a bit ambiguous because where's the emission when you eat a snack bar, right? So then it gets really complicated. But the idea is that we can hold us accountable for our actions. And I think what's becoming clearer is that yes, maybe we can hold the consumer accountable for some of it, but at the end of the day, this becomes a society-wide, systems level issue where the individual has very little actual um, agency to make changes that are meaningful. And once we realize that, and I think it's starting to come through in the IPCC reports when they're telling us we need to change the entire society, once that comes through, I think we need to start thinking about the problem in a different way. And to me, that means going to the place in the supply chain that has the most agency. And the place in the supply chain that has the most agency is actually at the product creation, those who produce the hydrocarbons. And it's not a punishment, it's simply that this is the easiest place where change can happen. Now, in the discussions, it's been about phasing out hydrocarbons. And I think in the long run, that's probably where the entirety of society needs to go for many reasons. But I think one thing we can see from um, the history of energy use is that we are still consuming as much biomass today as we were in the 1800s. And so to me, it seems unlikely that we will wean ourselves out of fossil fuels. And it would then suggest that the alternative is to clean up fossil fuels and um, make them compatible, I guess, with a finite carbon budget. And that means we would then require all hydrocarbons to be matched with an equivalent amount of sequestration. And if that's the case, then the extended producer responsibility type of idea, instead of a polluter's pay type of idea, is the one that would make the most sense in terms of completing the transition to a climate friendly or a carbon neutral, whatever we want to call it, type of economy that is circular in its nature, right? So every fossil carbon that comes in is going to be matched by fossil carbon that is put away. And this will give us a circular type of economy. So I think for me, it's fine to continue with polluter pays, but I think we also need to recognize there is this whole other lever that we have at our disposal, and that is the producer pays. And it is likely to be more actionable in the end result that we are seeking. We can have a whole discussion about the political feasibility and the legal pathways of that, and that can be for another time, let's say.
Right. All right. Thanks for that. Okay, let's get into our audience questions. The first one's is a comment, but I think it invites a response. Note that 100 years was selected not as an arbitrary decision, but rather as a practical economic reality. If you use any level of economic discounting, the damage function tails off pretty quickly after 100 years. So damage 200 years out is very speculative. We could be entering a solar low and wanting more atmospheric heat at that point, or we may have adapted, such as the additional heat could cause very little damage. The presumption that the biophysical is the arbiter of damage is not one that's easily supported, which is why the social economic is what has largely been used to define damage. What do you think? Is that the metric rather than the what the scientific consensus tells us? And what role? I was going to ask you this before, and we could fold that into this. What role should discounting play in making these determinations?
Yeah, and I think that that aligns very nicely with the history of why we selected 100 years. And you, the person is completely correct that it was based on economic models. There is a whole paper that argues why this number is the best number, and it is all about the discounting. The models blow up if you extend it beyond 100 years. And it was also because when this was being decided, there were no alternatives. The options were we either completely phase out fossil fuels or we do nothing. And the idea of doing nothing or phasing out fossil fuels were equally unpalatable. And if you do select a longer timescale, then you have to if you do select a longer timescales, then you do have to select to phase out fossil fuels. And so that was seen as completely unmanageable at the time. Now, the idea that we can use discount rates when it comes to the future of humanity, I think is a huge point of discussion that we should be having, because discount rates are fine for financial decisions, but they're not fine when it comes to the lives of people and societies. And there's a whole body of literature on that point. The idea is that it completely hinges on how we see future societies being able to handle the situation. And we could say that with economic growth, future society will be better equipped to deal with the issue. And like the person asking the question, they could decide that we actually need more warming. I very much doubt that, but they they could decide that. But the alternative is also true. We have a priori no reason to believe they will be in a better situation than we are today to manage this issue. In fact, in many instances, it looks like the children are more financially worse off than the parents. So there is already evidence in some countries that this is the case. So I think it would be quite self-serving to make that argument based on the optimism that the future might be better off. And so this is a whole idea of why we thought that considering the damages and not being certain of what the future holds is a better way to think through this problem.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? I mean, it's a really nerdy question, but where to set that discount rate, right? It makes a huge difference, right, in terms of potential liability and policy making, right? So it's interesting to think about. Okay, next question. You spoke about intergenerational equity, but I'd like to ask about other kinds of equity related especially to geological storage. Waste management of other wastes are known for injustices, such as citing disposal sites among people of least political power. Geological storage, as you noted, always comes with some amount of risk. Can long-term carbon, quote, waste management, close quote, be equitable beyond intergenerational equity?
Yeah, that's a huge question too, and one that has been discussed quite avidly in the literature. Um, so yes, you're completely correct. All of these types of methods are going to come with many different types of problems um, for people, for the environment, for the interactions between them. So all of these things have to be considered as these methods are being considered. And just to be clear, it's not just geological storage that comes with these issues. It's also forestry. It's also blue carbon. It's also ocean iron fertilization, right? All of these will have these sorts of questions attached.
Hmm.
And so, yes, all of these things must be considered as these methods are being um, talked about. Now, one thing that really comes to mind about this is the the fact that since the scientific community has come to the conclusion it is now impossible to stop climate change without the use of these technologies, it would bear to reason that stopping the use of these technologies would also come with enormous equity considerations that go beyond intergenerational equity, that go beyond the use of these technologies and the impacts these would have. And so I think I'm probably falling more into the camp of that, which is that we should consider these technologies because we now have no other option to stop climate change. But when we do consider these technologies, we should consider a whole suite of questions to ensure that they are deployed in a way that is equitable. And on top of it, we should then consider how long is long enough. So I don't think it's intergenerational equity only. I think it's all of the above.
Okay. All right. Next question. Can you provide more examples of permanent storage in addition to mineralization?
Um, maybe.
Right, right. I
Uh,
mean, it's interesting, right? Because a lot of them, I think that we denominate as permanent, right? Have big asterisks and question marks, right? I mean, it's highly contested, right? With a number of approaches at this point,
yeah,
right? Mineralization's kind of the poster child.
yeah, mineralization is definitely the poster child. There are a few techniques um, where, like you said, there are big asterisks. So when we consider enhanced rock weathering, when we
Hmm.
consider ocean alkalinization enhancement, those would be ones that I would say could potentially be considered permanent, but more research is necessary at this stage. Then, of course, there's the geological storage um, in just your typical saline aquifer type of situation. I guess I'd put the mafic rock type of sequestration more in the mineralization, but so your
Hmm.
typical conventional type of geological sequestration would likely fall into the permanent category. Then there's a whole suite of other technologies that I think the questions become bigger and bigger as to whether it's even feasible for those methods to reach those timescales. I know some folks have been talking about biochar
Hmm.
There's some new studies that are suggesting that depending on how you cook the biomass essentially and the type of biomass that you use, that you could essentially convert it to coal. And as we know, coal is pretty much permanent. Um, and so if that's the case, then maybe biochar would be a permanent solution. But I think there's still some big questions that remain on is that true and in what conditions? And there's questions about soils and how they work and whether they could be considered permanent. But I think here again, the questions are bigger and bigger. So I think the bucket is bigger than we think, but it's definitely not as big as everything that has been proposed.
Hmm. Yeah, that would obviously have some real implications, right, in terms of the development of the industry, right, and who we privilege for those longer term sort of
Yeah,
contracts in place.
but just to go back to the fact that if we do require that guarantee upfront, and if we do accept horizontal stacking, then
Hmm.
there is no
Right.
need to, um, I guess, make the tunnel narrow, right? It's we are allowing for a greater range of options. It's just we
Hmm.
have to be honest that they will not be permanent, and therefore we do need those contractual means to guarantee that if carbon escapes, it is put back and making sure that's paid up front. So I think broadening how which technologies can fit in the mechanism without lowering the standard of what's permanent is going to be important.
Okay. All right. Next question. We've kind of talked about this already, but it maybe, given the fact there's a question, maybe we need to clarify it again. It says, could you please specify the year amount considered permanent that you're recommending? The slides indicated tens of thousands of years. Can you specify this?
Yeah, I guess in the end we had to pick a number and we said 10,000. But I think when we look at the carbon cycle and we think about the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum, we're talking about 130,000 years, right? So, um, uh, but I think there is an important observation here, which is that there is actually quite a big difference between 1,000 years and 10,000 years compared to
Mm,
10,000 years and 100,000 years,
right.
because the types of methods that fall along that line are very different. The methods that can reach 10,000 years no longer include the oceans.
Hmm.
But every method that go beyond 10,000 years can go to 100,000 years. And so I think there is a threshold that gets crossed some point around 10,000. It's very hard to pinpoint in the end exactly what it is. But I will say if you do use the IPCC carbon cycle numbers, the fluxes and the reservoirs, you actually can back calculate the time constants and you actually find that the number is roughly 9,000 years um, between the what goes into the oceans and what goes into the geology. So somewhere around that line. In the end, I'm not entirely sure the exact number matters other than when you input it into policy, but in the scientific realm, it probably doesn't matter.
Right. But does that mean, given the fact you say, well, we can't contractually guarantee this, right? But if from a biophysical perspective, it actually will happen, right? Do we create a a list, as it were, and perhaps it's potentially a dynamic list based on future insights into questions of permanence, right? Where things might fall off the list or might be added to the list, right? But do we create a list that says these are the only approaches that will count as long term, and we set that at the those upper limits of 9 or 10,000 years as opposed to 1,000 years or 100 years, just because 100 is practical from a contractual standpoint. What does it look like in terms of operationalizing it from a policy perspective?
Yeah, I do think a dynamic list is probably close to what I would imagine would work. And that dynamic list should be based on scientific case arguments essentially for a specific technology. And it should be agreed upon. It should be going through a scientific process. And at the end, it should say, okay, well, I guess we agree with the current level of understanding that this is going to match those timescales. And the reason it needs to be dynamic is because science changes and we may find different arguments in the future or different evidence that tell us otherwise. It may also mean that other technologies could get included in this way. For example, that whole biochar situation, right? So things do change. So having a list like that that says these are the technologies that have been vetted through a scientific process that reaches these types of standards. And then everything else means they have to be contractually required to pay upfront for horizontal stacking. And whether
Hmm.
you want to stack two short permanent, and then the third one is two temporary, and then the third is permanent, or one permanent directly, or one, you know what I mean? Like there's different ways that you can stack them horizontally, but they have to come with that guarantee that you have paid upfront for the next certificate that comes.
Okay. All right. I think we have time for one final questions. What are the implications of this logic for carbon accounting models that necessitate valuation of short-term carbon storage, such as dynamic embodied carbon accounting in building materials, where without any carbon storage quantification, more carbon-intensive materials may be used instead, ultimately emitting more carbon? That's how nerdy we get on this in this series. What do you
And I will
think?
respond, that's my favorite topic to talk
Yeah,
about.
yeah. Well, I kind of knew that. So,
Um, yes. So the current system of carbon accounting often entangles duration into the carbon accounting quantification. And I honestly think, based on the research I've been doing with my colleague and others, that this is a mistake. It is a mistake to combine the duration into the carbon accounting quantification. And the reason being exactly what the person is asking. How do we then think about the shorter term duration if it's already quantified in the carbon accounting? And I think the solution to that, and what I've been working on in trying to explore whether or not it would work, but is to completely separate the two. We need to be measuring how much carbon is stored, and that is a completely separate and independent question to how long the carbon can be stored. One is a question of durability, which can be assessed through scientific means. One is a question of quantification, which also can be assessed through scientific means. But the entanglement is the policy decision to entangle. And separating them would then allow for the whole system that I've been describing, where we do have higher standards for carbon sequestration durations, and it doesn't prohibit the shorter term storage from playing in the game. But it is a deep rooted carbon accounting choice that we have made a long time ago that is now continuing. But I do think it's a choice that is going to hinder a lot of carbon sequestration methodologies if we continue.
okay. All right. I think that's a good place to end it. And I have to say, obviously, these issues of defining durability are really important, but I think some of these underlying principles that we're talking about, like polluter pays and intergenerational equity, right, are really important in general to be discussed in the context of carbon removal, right, and what the implications are for obligations, right? I mean, one of the things that the paper alluded to was the Indians' argument, for example, that notions of intergenerational equity and probably intragenerational equity, right, might justify mandates of carbon removal on those that can pay, right? And so I think it has broader implications. So I'm glad that that was really kind of fleshed out in this paper too. So with that, we have reached the top of the clock, and I would like to once again thank Stephanie Arcusa and obviously Klaus Lackner as the co-author for this paper, and Stephanie for you coming on the show. And thanks to everyone who's joined us. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. For those who celebrate it, happy Thanksgiving, and we look forward to seeing you again. Bye for now.
Thanks very much, Will.